I never thought I'd end up in a place like Ironwood Penitentiary. Built in the 1920s and nicknamed the Iron Cage, it was a fortress of steel and stone, a holding ground for the worst of the worst. But a drunk night, a fight gone bad, and an unlucky swing put me there for manslaughter. What I didn't know then was that the cage held more than just inmates. It held something darker. The first thing that hits you when you arrive is the weight of the place. It presses down on you like it's alive, watching, judging. The air smells of damp concrete and despair, but there's an undercurrent of something metallic, like blood that's been scrubbed away but never truly gone. When I got to Block D, the oldest wing of the prison, the guards laughed as they tossed me into my cell. "Welcome to the haunted block," one sneered. "Don't let the ghosts bite." I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. My cellmate, Manny, was an older guy with a shiv scar running across his cheek. He didn't waste time with small talk. Keep your head down, don't trust the guards, and whatever you do, don't look at the mirror after lights out. There was an old metal mirror bolted to the wall, warped and rusted from decades of steam and sweat. I didn't understand his warning at first, but Manny was dead serious. He said this place was cursed, that men had seen things in that mirror, things that didn't belong to this world. "Some folks say it's a window to hell," he muttered. "Others think it's the souls of the damned who died in here. Either way, it's bad news." That first night, I lay awake on the lumpy cot, listening to the sounds of the block, the distant clang of a door, the murmurs of inmates. And then just as I started to drift off, I heard it, a low whisper, faint but sharp, like it was meant for my ears alone. "John? John!" My eyes snapped open. Nobody had called my name, but the whisper was there, just beyond the cell bars. I told myself it was my imagination, but my pulse was racing. Manny stirred in his bunk. "They've noticed you," he said without looking at me. "Ignore it." The next day, I learned about Charlie Griggs. He was a lifer who'd been locked up in Block D back in the 50s. Rumor had it Charlie had gone insane, smashing his cell mirror to pieces before hanging himself with a bedsheet. They say his ghost still roams the block, angry and restless, punishing anyone who dared to look too long in the mirror. I laughed it off. Ghost stories, I thought. Just a way for bored prisoners to scare the new guy. But that night, I started to believe. Lights out came, and I lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling. Manny was snoring softly when I heard it again. That whisper. Only this time, it was closer. "John, over here." It sounded like it was coming from the mirror. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirror was dark, reflecting the faint glint of the moonlight streaming through the high, barred window. I told myself not to look, but curiosity clawed at me. I leaned forward, just enough to catch my reflection. At first, it was just me, pale and sweaty, staring back. But then the surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. And behind my reflection, a shadow moved. I froze. It wasn't Manny. He was still snoring. This shadow was wrong. It had no shape, no features, just a writhing mass of darkness that twisted and churned like it was alive. My reflection's eyes widened, but the shadow didn't stop. It pressed forward until it loomed just behind me, and then it smiled. Not me. Not my reflection. The shadow smiled, sharp and jagged, and I swear to God I felt its breath on my neck. I screamed. Manny bolted upright, his eyes wide with fear. "You looked, didn't you, you stupid bastard?" I couldn't speak. All I could do was point at the mirror, but the shadow was gone. The surface was still rippling slightly, but it was empty. The next day, I begged the guards to move me to another block, but they just laughed. "You think you're special? Everyone sees things in Block D. Deal with it." The whispers didn't stop after that. They grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes they weren't even words, just a chorus of guttural noises that made my skin crawl. Manny started getting twitchy too. One night, he woke me up, shaking my arm. "Do you hear them?" he asked, his voice trembling. I nodded. "They're coming for you," he said. "I've seen it before. They choose someone, and they don't stop until they take them." "What do they want?" I whispered. Manny's eyes darted to the mirror. "To drag you down there, to where they are." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my cot, staring at the mirror, daring it to show me something. Anything. And it did. At first, it was just my reflection again, but then the surface darkened, and I saw something else. A hallway, long and narrow, with flickering lights. It wasn't part of the prison I knew. It looked older, dirtier. The walls were streaked with rust, or maybe blood, and at the end of the hallway stood a figure. It was a man, tall and thin, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and black. He raised a hand, pointing directly at me, and then he started to walk. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the wall. The figure didn't stop. He kept walking, closer and closer, until his hand pressed against the other side of the mirror. "John?" The whisper came from his mouth this time, but it was the same voice I'd heard in the dark. My body froze, and for a moment I thought he was going to step through the mirror and into my cell. But then Manny grabbed me, shaking me hard. "Don't let him in," he shouted. "Look away." I tore my eyes away, and the moment I did, the whisper stopped. The room was silent again, but my heart was still racing. Manny sat on the edge of his cot, breathing hard. "You're marked now," he said. "He's coming for you." Over the next few days, I tried everything to avoid the mirror. I covered it with a shirt, avoided my cell as much as I could, but it didn't matter. The whispers followed me. I started seeing shadows in my peripheral vision, darting just out of sight. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hallway, that figure, waiting at the end. Manny couldn't take it anymore. One night, he snapped, smashing the mirror with a metal tray. The shards clattered to the floor, but instead of breaking, they shimmered, and for a split second, I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, screaming silently from within the shards. Manny screamed too, clutching his head, and then he collapsed. The guards found his body the next morning. They said it was a heart attack, but I knew better. I was alone in the cell after that, but the haunting didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. The figure in the mirror wasn't confined anymore. I saw him in my dreams, standing at the foot of my bed, his black eyes boring into mine. I heard his voice, whispering promises of pain, of torment. And then one night, he came. The lights in the block flickered, and the air grew cold, bone-chilling cold. My breath fogged up in front of me, and the whispers grew deafening. I curled up on the cot, praying for it to stop, but the figure was there, stepping out of the darkness, out of the mirror. He stood over me, his head tilting unnaturally, and he reached out with those long, skeletal fingers. "It's time, John," he whispered. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was in the infirmary. They said I'd been screaming, banging on the walls, but I don't remember any of it. They moved me to a different block after that, said I was a danger to myself. But sometimes at night, I still hear the whispers, and I know one day he'll come back for me.
Story number 2.
I spent 3 years in Stone Mill Correctional Facility, a rotting relic of a prison in the middle of nowhere. The place was infamous, not just for the violence and misery inside its walls, but for something darker. Everyone had heard the stories about the disappearances, the shadows that moved when no one was there, and the strange guttural noises that echoed through the halls at night. I thought they were just tales to scare newcomers, until I met Devin. Devin was my cellmate, a wiry guy with hollow eyes and a nervous twitch. He'd been in Stone Mill for 5 years, and something about him was off. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in a low whisper, like he was afraid someone, or something, might overhear. It wasn't until my second month there that he finally opened up. One night, after lights out, he leaned in close and said, "Have you heard about the 3rd floor?" I shook my head. The 3rd floor of Block E had been sealed off for decades. The guards said it was unsafe, but Devin had a different story. "They call it the wailing floor," he said, his voice trembling. Back in the 40s, there was a riot. Guards killed over 20 inmates, shot them down like dogs. After that, weird things started happening. Men went missing. Guards quit without notice. Some even took their own lives. He paused, glancing toward the cell door as if checking for unseen eyes. "They say the souls of the dead never left, that they're still up there, waiting." I laughed it off. "Ghost stories? Come on, man." Devin didn't laugh. He just looked at me with those hollow eyes and said, "You'll see." I didn't believe him. Not at first, but then the dreams started. They began innocently enough. Flashes of empty hallways, the sound of distant footsteps, but they grew darker. I started seeing faces, twisted and burned, their mouths open in silent screams. And always, I heard the wailing, a low, mournful sound that burrowed into my skull and stayed with me even after I woke up. I told myself it was just stress. This place had a way of messing with your head. But then things began to happen while I was awake. One night, I was on kitchen duty, mopping the floor in the staff area. It was late, and the place was empty except for me, or so I thought. As I worked, I heard it, a faint whisper, just beyond the edge of hearing. I froze, listening. The whisper grew louder, turning into a hiss. "Get out!" I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to keep working. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just my nerves. Then the lights flickered. For a split second, the room went pitch black. When the lights came back on, I wasn't alone. At the far end of the room stood a figure, tall and shadowy, its face obscured. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and hungry. I dropped the mop and bolted. When I told Devin what I'd seen, he nodded grimly. "They're getting closer," he said. "Once they notice you, they don't stop." I tried to stay calm, to convince myself it was all in my head, but the incidents kept piling up. I'd see movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there. Objects in my cell would shift when I wasn't looking. And the wailing, God, the wailing grew louder, seeping into every corner of my mind. One night, I woke to find Devin sitting upright on his bunk, staring at the door. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. "They're here," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, the cell door creaked open. It shouldn't have been possible. The doors were locked electronically, and there was no way it could have opened on its own. But there it was, swinging slowly inward. Beyond the door, the hallway was dark, too dark. The overhead lights barely penetrated the shadows, and the air was heavy, suffocating. "Don't go," Devin said, grabbing my arm. His grip was icy. But something was calling me, a pull I couldn't resist. I stepped into the hallway, ignoring Devin's protests. The air grew colder with each step, and the wailing grew louder, echoing off the stone walls. The shadows seemed to move, writhing like living things. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway was the stairwell to the third floor. The door, which had been chained and padlocked for years, was wide open. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. Something was drawing me forward, an invisible hand pulling me toward the darkness. As I climbed the stairs, the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. The wailing was deafening now, a cacophony of pain and despair that made my head throb. When I reached the third floor, I stopped. The hallway stretched before me, long and narrow, lit only by a flickering bulb. The walls were stained with dark streaks, and the air reeked of decay. And then I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, their forms twisted and broken. Some crawled on all fours, their limbs bent at impossible angles. Others shuffled forward, their faces gaunt and lifeless. Their eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their mouths moved, but no words came out, only that horrible wailing. They surrounded me, their cold hands brushing against my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't move. One of them stepped forward, its face inches from mine. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You're one of us now," it rasped. The next thing I knew, I was back in my cell, lying on the floor. Devin was gone. The guard said he escaped, but I knew better. He was taken. The whispers still haunt me, even now. I hear them in the dead of night, calling me back to the third floor. Sometimes I see shadows moving in the corners of my vision, and I know they're watching, waiting. And I know one day I won't be able to resist.
Story number 3.
When I first arrived at Red Rock Penitentiary, I thought the stories were just rumors, the kind of exaggerated tales that get passed down to rookies like me. I was a new corrections officer, fresh out of training and eager to prove myself. But Red Rock wasn't like any prison I'd heard of. The prison was ancient, a massive stone fortress built in the late 1800s. It loomed over the barren desert like a relic of a crueler time. Most of the original structure was crumbling, but one part of the prison was still in use, cell block F, known by everyone as the Tomb. The first time I set foot in the tomb, I felt it. The air was heavy, the kind of thick stillness that makes your skin crawl. The inmates were quiet, too quiet. No yelling, no banging on the bars, just a tense silence that pressed down on you like a weight. I asked one of the older guards about it during my first shift. He gave me a grim look and said, "You'll figure it out soon enough. Just watch your back." It wasn't long before I did. My first few weeks were uneventful, but the strangeness started when I was assigned to the night shift. The first night as I made my rounds, I noticed something odd. A low humming sound echoed through the halls, almost like a chant. It wasn't coming from the inmates. They were all asleep or pretending to be, their faces turned toward the walls. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I tried to ignore it, but it got under my skin. The next night it happened again, only louder. This time I followed it. The humming led me to the far end of the block, to cell 17. Cell 17 was empty. It had been empty for years, ever since the last occupant, an inmate named Victor Reyes, hung himself in his cell. The guard said he'd gone insane, babbling about voices and shadows that whispered to him at night. They found him swinging from the ceiling one morning, his eyes wide open, staring at something no one else could see. I shined my flashlight into the cell, but there was nothing there, just an old cot and a rusted toilet. The humming stopped the moment I stepped closer, and the silence that followed was deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine, like I was being watched. The next day, I asked around about Cell 17. The older guards didn't want to talk about it, but one of them, a guy named Harris, finally gave me the rundown. "They say this place is cursed," he said. "The inmates, the guards, it doesn't matter. Red Rock takes a piece of you." Harris told me about the history of the prison, about the riots and the executions, the cruelty and suffering that had soaked into the walls. He said Cell 17 was the worst of it. Ray's wasn't the first, he said. Every inmate who stayed in that cell either went insane or killed themselves, and anyone who spends too much time near it. He trailed off, but the look in his eyes said enough. I wanted to laugh it off, to chalk it up to superstition. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that place. The next night, I made my rounds as usual, but when I got to Cell 17, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door, which had been sealed shut for years, was open. I froze, my hand gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. I knew for a fact that cell was locked. Nobody had the key except the warden, and he never used it. The humming started again, low and mournful, and I swear I could feel it vibrating in my chest. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I stepped closer. The air inside the cell was freezing, colder than the rest of the block. My breath fogged up in front of me as I shined my flashlight inside. At first I thought it was empty, but then I saw it. Scratch marks on the walls, hundreds of them, crisscrossing the stone like desperate clawing. And there in the corner was something that hadn't been there before. A pile of old, yellowed papers. I picked one up and shined my light on it. The writing was barely legible, scrawled in a shaky hand. It wasn't a letter or a journal entry, it was a list of names. The first name on the list was Victor Reyes. The names continued, dozens of them, each one crossed out except for the last. My stomach turned when I saw it. It was my name. I dropped the paper and stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw the shadow. It was in the corner, darker than the rest of the cell, shifting and writhing like it was alive. It stretched out, long and thin, crawling up the walls and across the floor, and then it turned toward me. There were no eyes, no face, but I knew it was looking at me. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the cold desert night. I told the warden I was sick and needed a few days off. He didn't argue. He probably saw the panic in my eyes. But staying away didn't help. The dream started that night. I was back in Cell 17, trapped inside. The walls were closing in, the air growing colder with every breath. The humming filled my ears, louder and louder until it was all I could hear. And then the shadow appeared, slithering toward me, wrapping around my body like smoke. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The dreams came every night after that. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, I couldn't escape. The shadow followed me, its presence lingering just out of sight, just out of reach. When I returned to work, I found out Harris had been transferred. The other guards said he'd been acting strange, mumbling to himself, staring at the walls like he was seeing things no one else could. I didn't last much longer. One night while on patrol, I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned, there was no one there. But the air was cold, and I knew it was close. I quit the next day. It's been years since I left Red Rock, but the shadow never left me. Sometimes I see it in the corner of my bedroom, just a flicker of movement in the darkness. Sometimes I hear the humming, faint and distant, like a warning. And every now and then I find scratches on my walls.
Story number 4.
I never believed in ghosts until I ended up in Greystone Penitentiary. I wasn't there as an inmate. I was hired to work as a maintenance technician after the place reopened. Greystone had been abandoned for decades before the state decided to convert it into a low-security facility. My job was simple: fix what could be fixed and document what couldn't. From the moment I stepped through the gates, I knew something was wrong. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the building seemed to hum with a low, inaudible frequency. The inmates and guards didn't talk much, and when they did, it was in hushed tones, as if they were afraid someone or something might overhear. I started hearing the stories on my second day. "There's something in the East Wing," one of the guards, Peterson, told me during a smoke break. He looked over his shoulder as he spoke, as if the walls themselves might be listening. They say it's haunted. Men go missing. Some come back, but they're not the same. I laughed it off. Haunted prison? That's a little on the nose, don't you think? Peterson didn't laugh. You'll see, he said grimly. The East Wing was the oldest part of the prison, a sprawling maze of cells that had been closed off after a riot decades ago. My work orders said I was supposed to assess the area for structural damage, but no one had set foot in there for years. When I finally unlocked the gate to the East Wing, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Damp, rotting wood mixed with something metallic. Blood? No, it couldn't be. The halls were dark, the overhead lights barely flickering to life as I moved through. Every sound, my footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, echoed endlessly, making it impossible to tell if I was alone. I started my inspection, noting the cracked walls and rusted bars. That's when I heard it. A whisper. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. Help me. I swung the flashlight around, but the hallway was empty. Just rows of empty cells staring back at me. Hello, I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but my heart was racing. I finished my inspection as quickly as possible and got out of there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the whisper in my head, repeating over and over, help me, help me. The next day, I told Peterson what had happened. He just shook his head. You should stay out of the East Wing, he said. It's not safe. I didn't listen. 2 nights later, I was back. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or something else, something I couldn't explain. The whispers had stopped, but I felt like they were pulling me back, like an invisible thread was tugging at my mind. This time, I brought a camera, thinking I could prove to myself there was nothing there. The East Wing was just as I'd left it, dark, damp, and eerily silent. I made my way to the end of the corridor, where the cells were in the worst condition. My flashlight caught something unusual on the wall, a series of scratches, deep gouges carved into the stone. They weren't random. They formed words. Leave now. I took a step back, my heart pounding. That's when I saw it. A figure at the end of the hall. It was barely visible, a shadowy outline that flickered in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unrelenting. I raised my camera, snapping a picture, but when I lowered it, the figure was gone. The cell door next to me slammed shut. I spun around, my flashlight darting from cell to cell, but there was no one there. The whispers started again, louder this time, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. Help me. Get out. Leave. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the main building, gasping for breath. Peterson found me sitting in the break room, pale and shaking. You saw it, didn't you? He asked. I nodded. He sat down across from me, his face grim. They say it's the spirits of the prisoners who died in the riot. The guards locked them in their cells and set the place on fire, burned alive. They've been trapped here ever since. I wanted to quit right then and there, but I needed the money. I told myself I could avoid the East Wing, that I'd be safe as long as I stayed away. But it didn't matter. The whispers followed me. I started hearing them everywhere, in the halls, in the break room, even in my apartment. They grew louder at night until I couldn't sleep. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. One night, I woke to find my bedroom freezing cold, my breath fogging up in the air. The whispers were deafening now, and when I turned toward the door, I saw it. The figure from the East Wing was standing there, its shadow stretching across the room. It raised an arm, pointing at me, and in that moment I felt pure, unrelenting terror. I don't remember what happened next. I must have passed out because I woke up the next morning on the floor, my body drenched in sweat. I called Peterson and told him I was quitting. He didn't try to stop me. Smart move, he said. But leaving doesn't mean you're safe. They don't let go that easily. He was right. It's been months since I left Greystone, but the whispers haven't stopped. They follow me everywhere, growing louder every night. The shadows are getting closer too, lingering just at the edge of the light. I know it's only a matter of time before they catch up to me, and when they do, I don't think I'll be able to escape.
Story number 5.
When I first got locked up in Black Hollow Penitentiary, I thought the worst thing I'd face would be the other inmates. I was wrong. Black Hollow wasn't just a prison. It was a tomb. Built in the early 1900s, it had been the site of countless executions. They still used the old electric chair back when they first opened, a relic nicknamed the Whisperer, because prisoners swore they heard it hum long before it was ever turned on. The day I arrived, The warden gave us a speech about rules and respect, but it was his last words that stuck with me. Stay away from death row. It's off limits for a reason. Death row had been closed for decades, sealed off after a fire gutted most of the wing. Nobody had been inside since, and rumors about the place spread like wildfire. Some inmates said it was haunted by the prisoners who'd been executed there. Others claimed the fire had been no accident, but nobody seemed to know the truth. It didn't take long for me to start hearing strange things at night. My cell was in Block D, close enough to death row that you could feel the chill seeping through the walls. The first night, I heard faint footsteps echoing down the hall. It didn't make sense. Lights out was strictly enforced, and the guards didn't patrol this late. I brushed it off as my imagination. But the next night it happened again. This time I heard something else. A low, raspy whisper, too faint to make out the words, but unmistakably there. I told my cellmate Carter about it the next morning. He laughed, shaking his head. Guess you're hearing them, huh? Hearing who? The ones who never left, he said. Death row's cursed, man. You keep listening, it'll drive you mad. I wanted to believe he was just messing with me, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. Carter had been in Black Hollow for 10 years, and he'd seen things he didn't like to talk about. By the end of my first week, the whispers were getting louder. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, an endless murmur that grew more insistent as the nights went on. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. The other inmates started noticing. You look like hell, Carter said one morning. I can't take it, I admitted. The whispers, they won't stop. He sighed. You're hearing the condemned. The condemned? The ones who burned in the fire. They say the guards locked the doors and let them die. A revenge thing. Riot had just happened, and they wanted to make an example. Now their spirits are trapped, waiting for someone to listen. I didn't believe him. Not really. But that night I found out just how real it was. It was late past midnight when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were louder, heavier, like boots stomping on the cold concrete floor. I lay there, frozen, as they got closer and closer. Then the door to my cell rattled. Who's there? I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. The air grew colder, and for the first time I saw it, a shadow moving in the darkness. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It had form, shape, and it was staring right at me. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices filling the cell until I thought I'd lose my mind. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. Help us, one voice said, clear as day. I bolted upright, breathing hard, but the shadow was gone. The cell was quiet again, but I knew I wasn't alone. The next morning, I told Carter what had happened. He didn't look surprised. They've marked you, he said. Marked me? What does that mean? It means they're not going to leave you alone. Not unless you do something about it. Like what? You gotta go to them. The idea was insane, but by then I was desperate. That night, when the guards weren't looking, I slipped out of my cell and made my way toward death row. The air grew colder with every step, the faint scent of smoke lingering in the hall. When I reached the old rusted gate that sealed off the wing, I stopped. Help us. The voices were louder now, coming from beyond the gate. My hands shook as I pushed it open, the metal groaning like a dying animal. Death row was a nightmare. The walls were blackened with soot, the bars twisted and warped from the fire. The air was thick, choking, and the whispers surrounded me like a swarm. I moved deeper into the wing, my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. Why are you here? A voice whispered, so close it felt like it was right in my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. Help us, another voice pleaded. I stopped in front of cell 13, the last cell in the row. The door was open, and inside the walls were covered in writing, scratched into the stone by desperate hands. Burned alive. No escape. Save us. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and then I saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, their faces burned and twisted, their eyes hollow. They surrounded me, their hands outstretched. Help us, they said in unison, their voices echoing like thunder. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. One of them stepped forward, its face inches from mine, its eyes burned with an unnatural light. You have to tell them, it said. They must know what happened here. Tell who? I managed to choke out. The living, it hissed. Or you will join us. The next thing I knew, I was back in my cell, shaking and drenched in sweat. The whispers stopped after that, but the memory of those burned faces haunted me. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I told the warden everything. He laughed at first, but when I described the writing on the walls in cell 13, his face went pale. They erased that, he muttered. What? After the fire, we cleaned the wing, covered up the truth. There's no way you could have seen that. But I had. And now, he knew I wasn't lying. A few weeks later, the state ordered an investigation into Black Hollow's history. They uncovered documents proving that the fire had been intentional, a cover-up for the execution of over 20 inmates. The truth finally came out, and death row was permanently sealed. I'd like to say that was the end of it, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and I know they're waiting.
Story number 6.
When I first got the job as a corrections officer at Willow Creek Asylum, I thought I had hit the jackpot. The pay was good, the benefits were solid, and the place hadn't housed patients for decades. The state had converted it into a medium security holding facility for inmates awaiting transfer to permanent prisons. Easy work, or so I thought. The stories started on my first day. Don't work the night shift alone. One of the veteran officers warned me during my orientation. His voice was low, his eyes darting around as if someone might overhear. "Why not?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, he said, "This place has history." I laughed it off. History? Sure, the place was old and creepy, but I wasn't the kind of guy to scare easily. I'd been in law enforcement for years, and I'd seen my fair share of bad things. Ghost stories weren't going to shake me. But it didn't take long for me to realize Willow Creek was different. My first night shift was quiet, too quiet. The inmates were subdued, almost unnervingly so. Most nights you'd expect at least some noise, snoring, murmurs, maybe a fight breaking out in one of the cells. But here, silence. It was past midnight when I started my rounds. The main hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. The cells were empty on this side of the building, part of the old asylum that had been deemed unfit for housing inmates. As I walked, I heard it. A faint sobbing. I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight sweeping the corridor. The sound seemed to come from one of the empty cells, but when I got closer, it stopped. I leaned into the cell, shining my light inside. The room was bare, just a cot, a rusted sink, and peeling paint on the walls. But for a moment, I thought I saw something in the corner, a shadow darker than the darkness around it. I blinked, and it was gone. I chalked it up to exhaustion and finished my shift without mentioning it to anyone. But the next night, it happened again. This time it wasn't sobbing. It was laughter. High-pitched, almost childlike, echoing down the hallway. I followed the sound to one of the old isolation rooms at the far end of the wing. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, the laughter stopped. The room was empty, but the air inside was ice cold, so cold I could see my breath. My skin prickled, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I backed out of the room and slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. When I told one of the other officers, he just shook his head. "I told you, man, this place is wrong. Back when it was an asylum, they did things to people in there. Experiments, torture. A lot of them died angry. You can feel it in the walls." I wanted to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The next few weeks were a blur of restless nights and unsettling experiences. Objects moved when no one was around. The intercom system crackled to life, broadcasting faint whispers that no one could explain. Once I heard someone call my name, only to turn around and find the hallway empty. The inmates noticed it too. They started complaining about the lights flickering in their cells, about feeling watched even when they were alone. One of them, a tough guy who never seemed scared of anything, begged to be moved out of his cell. "There's something in there," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what it is, but it's watching me." The warden dismissed the complaints, calling them prisoner paranoia, but I knew better. The breaking point came on a stormy night in October. I was on duty alone, patrolling the south wing, the oldest part of the building, where the asylum's most dangerous patients had been housed. The storm knocked out the power, plunging the entire facility into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and started making my way toward the backup generator room. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. As I passed by one of the empty cells, I heard it again. Laughter, faint and distorted, like it was coming from an old broken radio. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing down the hall. The laughter stopped, replaced by a low growl that made my blood run cold. I shined my flashlight into the cell, and that's when I saw it. A figure crouched in the corner, its back to me. Its body was twisted, unnaturally thin, and its skin was pale as a corpse. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative. It turned to look at me, and I'll never forget its face. Hollow eyes, a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, teeth sharp and jagged like broken glass. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure crawled toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by a clumsy puppeteer. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear it behind me, its laughter echoing through the halls, getting louder and louder. I made it to the generator room and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My hands fumbled with the controls as I tried to restore power, the sound of its laughter ringing in my ears. When the lights finally flickered back on, the sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but all I heard was silence. I didn't leave that room until my shift ended, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quit the next day. I don't know what's haunting Willow Creek, but I know it's not something I can fight or understand. The officers who stayed there, they say the activity is getting worse. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that laughter in my dreams, and I wake up wondering if I ever really escaped.
Story number 7.
The day I stepped foot into Hollow Ridge Correctional Facility, I felt the weight of something I couldn't explain. I wasn't an inmate. I was a psychologist hired to evaluate the prisoners. The facility was infamous, not for its conditions, but for its history. Rumors swirled about disappearances, unexplained deaths, and the warden's curse. The stories were easy to dismiss at first. Prison folklore, I thought. Every facility has its tales, exaggerated by years of whispers. But Hollow Ridge felt different, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. The first time I noticed something strange was during a session with an inmate named Ellis. He was quiet, his pale eyes darting around the room as if he were listening for something I couldn't hear. "Do you ever feel it?" he asked suddenly, interrupting my notes. "Feel what?" "The cold," he said, his voice a whisper. "It's not the air, it's them." I leaned forward. "Who's them?" Ellis glanced at the corner of the room, his jaw tightening. "The ones who never left." He refused to say more, but his words stuck with me. Later that week, I started noticing the cold myself. It wasn't the usual draft you'd expect in a building this old. It was sharp and biting, like stepping into a freezer. The strange thing was, it wasn't constant. It moved, drifting from room to room like a living thing. I chalked it up to bad insulation until the night I stayed late to catch up on paperwork. The facility was eerily quiet after hours. Most of the inmates were asleep, and the staff had dwindled to a skeleton crew. My office was in an older part of the building, away from the main cell blocks, and as the hours dragged on, I started to feel unsettled. The first thing I noticed was the sound. At first, it was faint, like someone dragging a chain across the floor. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just an inmate or a guard. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate, until it stopped right outside my office door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I walked to the door and opened it, peering into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty. Shaking my head, I returned to my desk, determined to finish my work and leave. But the moment I sat down, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in the air, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the far wall, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the shadow of a person. There was no one there to cast it. It was darker than the surrounding darkness, an unnatural void that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow stopped, and then it moved straight toward me. I grabbed my things and bolted, not stopping until I was outside in the cold night air. The next day, I told one of the guards about what had happened. He didn't laugh. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he said, his face grim. "Seen what?" He glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "The warden, or what's left of him." I frowned. "The warden? You mean the old one?" He nodded. "Back when this place was still new, the warden ran it like a kingdom. He was cruel, starved inmates, locked them in solitary for weeks, beat them for the smallest infraction. They say he even killed a few, made it look like accidents. One day, the prisoners had enough. There was a riot. They dragged him to the basement and..." He trailed off, his eyes dark. "And what?" I pressed. "They killed him," he said simply. "But not before he cursed this place. Said he'd never leave, that he'd make sure no one ever escaped. And he hasn't. You're not the first to see him." I wanted to dismiss it as a ghost story, but the look in his eyes made it hard to argue. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the basement. It wasn't part of my job, but I knew the facility had one. It had been sealed off years ago after the riot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see it for myself. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A few nights later, the power went out during a storm, and I found myself alone in the office with nothing but a flashlight. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I grabbed the flashlight and made my way toward the basement. The door was old and rusted, the lock broken. As I pushed it open, the smell hit me. A foul mix of mildew and something else, something metallic and sour. Blood? The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The air grew colder with every step, and I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a large, open room. Chains hung from the walls, and the floor was stained with dark, unidentifiable marks. And then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the room. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I saw him. He was tall, his figure obscured by shadows, but his eyes burned with a cold blue light. He wore a warden's uniform, tattered and stained, and in his hand he held a long, rusted chain. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't mean to. "You're all the same," he growled, cutting me off. "Inmates, guards, it doesn't matter. You're mine now." The chains in his hand rattled, and the room seemed to close in around me. Shadows moved along the walls, writhing like living things. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The stairs felt endless, and the sound of the chains followed me, growing louder and louder until I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me. I quit the next day. But even now, I can't escape Hollow Ridge. Sometimes late at night, I hear the sound of chains rattling in the distance, and I know the warden is still watching.
Story number 8.
I never believed in ghosts. I used to think all those horror stories were just campfire tales, designed to spook the gullible. That changed when I spent a week at Briarstone Penitentiary. Briarstone had been shut down for over 30 years, abandoned after a massive riot that left dozens of inmates and guards dead. The state wanted to demolish it, but there was one problem. Legal documentation was missing. That's where I came in. As a legal assistant for the state, I was sent to comb through the old records left in the prison's archives. The job seemed straightforward: dusty boxes, ancient paperwork, and a week of solitary work. Easy money. Or so I thought. The first day was uneventful. I arrived at the facility mid-morning, greeted by the warden's office, which had become my makeshift base of operations. The walls were yellowed with age, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and rust. The power had been restored temporarily for my stay, but most of the building remained dark. My task was to search the archives in the basement. The guard who escorted me there warned me about the unstable structure. "Stay in the main room," he said, shining his flashlight into the cavernous space. "The side corridors are unsafe. They haven't been touched since the riot." I nodded, eager to get started. I figured the real danger was stepping on a nail, not some old prison ghost. The first few hours were monotonous. Box after box of ancient files, half of them illegible from water damage. Occasionally, I'd hear a creak from above or the faint drip of water from somewhere deeper in the basement. I chalked it up to the building settling. Then, just before lunch, I heard it. A faint whisper. It was so quiet I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. I paused, straining to listen. "Get out!" The words were barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to laugh. Probably the wind, I told myself, brushing it off. But by the time I left for the day, the unease had taken root. The second day, things got worse. I arrived early, determined to finish the job quickly. The basement felt colder than before, the air heavy with an unplaceable tension. As I sifted through more files, I found something strange, a collection of reports from the day of the riot. Most of them were standard accounts of violence and chaos, but one file stood out. It was written by a guard, his handwriting shaky and hurried. Something was in the riot. Not someone, something. It wasn't human. I saw it move through the crowd. The inmates weren't fighting it, they were running from it. But there was nowhere to go. I don't know if anyone else saw, but I know what I saw. God help me. The report ended abruptly, the last few words smeared with what looked like blood. I felt a chill run down my spine and shoved the file back into the box. Just a scared man's ramblings, I told myself. But as I worked, the whispers returned. This time they were louder. "Leave now. Don't stay. Run." I froze, my hands trembling. The voices seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the room, but it was empty. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from one of the side corridors. Against my better judgment, I moved toward the sound. The corridor was pitch black, the beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The air was colder here, so cold I could see my breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. As I turned to leave, I saw it, just for a moment. A figure at the far end of the corridor, hunched and shadowy. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and I swear I heard it growl. I bolted, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back in the warden's office, the door locked behind me. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? The third night, I stayed late, determined to finish the job. The sooner I was out of Briarstone, the better. I was halfway through a box of files when the lights flickered and went out. The only illumination came from my flashlight and the faint moonlight filtering through the small barred windows. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each step. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam landed on a figure standing just outside the doorway. It was a man, or at least it had been. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. His prison uniform was torn and stained, and his skin was pale as death. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves. I backed away, my heart racing. "I'm just doing my job." His expression twisted into a sneer. So were we. The lights flickered back on, and he was gone. The final day, I decided to leave early. I didn't care about finishing the job. I just wanted out. But as I packed up my things, I noticed one final box sitting on the far side of the archive room. Something compelled me to open it. Inside was a single file labeled Incident Report, Final Entry. It was dated the day after the riot and signed by the prison's last warden. The report was brief, detailing the aftermath of the chaos, but at the bottom a chilling note had been scrawled. "They weren't supposed to die. They've bound themselves to this place, and now they won't leave. Neither will I. God forgive us for what we've done." As I read the note, the air grew colder. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent than ever. "Run. Leave now, before it's too late." The lights flickered, and I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure I'd seen before. But this time, he wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures filled the room, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They moved closer, their forms flickering like static. "Leave," the man whispered again, his voice layered with the echoes of the others. I didn't need to be told twice. I dropped the flashlight and ran, my footsteps echoing through the halls. When I finally burst out into the sunlight, I collapsed, gasping for air. I never went back to Briarstone. The state eventually demolished the facility, but I still have nightmares about that week. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up to whispers in the dark, and I wonder if the prisoners of Briarstone ever truly let me leave.
Story number 9.
I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and stories spread like wildfire. But there was one place no one talked about, at least not openly: Black Hollow Asylum. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, its jagged silhouette looming on the edge of the woods like a wound on the land. When I was a kid, older teens would dare each other to sneak in at night. Most didn't make it past the front gates, and those who did always came back pale and shaking, refusing to talk about what they'd seen. I thought it was all nonsense. Local ghost stories designed to scare kids into behaving. That was until last year, when my best friend Mark convinced me to go with him. "It's just an old building," he said, grinning as he held up his phone. "Come on, we'll film it, put it on YouTube, instant views." I should have said no. Every instinct in my body told me not to go, but Mark was relentless. He joked that I was scared, that I believed in ghosts like some superstitious grandma. I gave in, and that decision changed everything. We arrived at Black Hollow just before midnight, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The front gate was rusted, hanging open like a broken jaw. "See? Not so scary," Mark said, nudging me as we stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the main building. The asylum loomed before us, its windows shattered, thus the walls covered in creeping ivy. The air was colder here, unnaturally so, and I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me. Mark led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The main door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, revealing a long hallway lit with peeling wallpaper and rusted wheelchairs. "Creepy," Mark muttered, his voice unusually subdued. He started filming, panning the camera around the room. "All right, folks, this is Black Hollow Asylum. Let's see if we can find anything spooky." As we moved deeper into the building, the silence was suffocating. Every step echoed loudly, and the air grew colder with every passing minute. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of graffiti. Scrawled across the walls in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "Do not stay after midnight." Mark laughed nervously, brushing it off as an urban legend. They probably wrote this to scare people off. But I wasn't so sure. We reached what must have been the main ward, a massive room filled with rusted hospital beds and overturned tables. The air felt heavier here, as if the walls were holding their breath. As Mark scanned the room with his flashlight, something caught my eye, a shadow that didn't belong. It moved across the far wall, slow and deliberate, but there was no one there to cast it. "Did you see that?" I whispered, grabbing Mark's arm. "What?" he asked, frowning. "That shadow, over there." Mark swung his flashlight toward the spot, but it was gone. It's probably just the light playing tricks on you. But I knew what I'd seen. We continued exploring, but the unease only grew. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and faint whispers echoed through the halls. At first I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, forming words. "Help me! Get out!" I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. "Mark, do you hear that?" "Hear what?" he asked, his voice tinged with irritation. "The whispers." He shook his head. "You're just freaking yourself out. Let's keep going." We reached the basement stairs just before midnight. They were narrow and steep, descending into a darkness so complete it seemed alive. Mark hesitated for the first time. "What do you think? Should we check it out?" "No," I said firmly. "We've seen enough. Let's go." But Mark was already moving, his flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. "Mark, seriously. Come on, man. Don't chicken out now." I had no choice but to follow. The basement was colder than the rest of the building, the air damp and heavy with the smell of rot. The walls were lined with old pipes that dripped constantly, creating an uneven rhythm that set my teeth on edge. We found a small room at the end of the hallway, the door slightly ajar. Mark pushed it open, revealing a strange setup. The walls were covered in scratched symbols, and in the center of the room was a wooden chair bolted to the floor, its armrests stained with something dark. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered, filming the scene. I didn't answer. My attention was drawn to a dark corner of the room where the shadows seemed to twist and writhe like they were alive. "Mark, we need to leave. Now." "Relax," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. As he moved closer to the chair, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in the air, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't be here." The shadows in the corner began to shift, coalescing into a figure. It was humanoid, but wrong, its limbs too long, its face a featureless void. "Mark!" I screamed, grabbing his arm. He turned and saw it too, his face draining of color. "What the?" The thing moved toward us, its body gliding unnaturally over the floor. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the lights on our flashlights flickered violently. "Run!" I shouted, yanking Mark toward the door. We bolted up the stairs, the sound of heavy footsteps chasing us. The air was so cold it burned, and the whispers filled my head, a cacophony of voices all screaming the same thing: "Leave." We didn't stop running until we were outside, the asylum's shadow looming behind us. Mark and I never spoke about that night again. He deleted the footage, refusing to watch it. But things didn't go back to normal. I started waking up in the middle of the night, hearing those same whispers outside my window. Mark stopped sleeping altogether, plagued by nightmares of the shadowy figure. A few weeks later, he disappeared. The police found his car parked near the woods, not far from Black Hollow. They never found him, but I know where he went. I still hear the whispers sometimes. Faint and distant. They're calling me back, and I'm terrified I won't be able to resist much longer.